O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to talk to you guys about Paracelsus, alchemy, and natural theology. And so there is no real rhyme or reason for today's video topic other than just trying to keep things interesting. Our last video was on an introduction to pre-Socratic philosophy, about a 2.5-hour live stream. I recommend checking that out if you haven't. And before that, we're talking about secularism and the religionless religion of America. Well, today we're not really going to be getting into anything orthodox theology or anything like that, but we're going to be focusing on what I titled Christian magic, a very influential and important, I would say pivotal historical figure in Paracelsus. And so I'm sure some of you guys have heard of him. Many of you probably have not. And so I thought, well, that'd be a very interesting and great video topic, something that I'd like to dive into and talk about. And so that's what I chose. And so we're going to be looking at Paracelsus, a very famous German physician and alchemist. Spans a very interesting historical period. We're talking about 1491, I believe is the year he was, 1493 was when he was born, to 1541. And so the Reformation's right there in 1517. He is German. And he's considered the Luther of physicians. So we're going to be looking at Paracelsus. He's going to be picking up in really the sort of Hermetic, the Neoplatonic, the magical practice that began with the translation of the Hermetic corpus by Marsilio Ficino in Florence, Italy in the mid-15th century. And so I actually did a video about a year ago or so on Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, his famous student. He's known for creating what's called Christian Kabbalah, a reinterpretation of the Jewish Kabbalah as evidence for Christianity being the fulfillment of. So, not going to be getting too much into them. You can always check out my previous video on that if you're interested, but we will be highlighting their influence upon Paracelsus. Paracelsus and really his major contributions to the realm of ideas, the Western esoteric traditions, but also medicine. And so, again, he was a physician, he was an alchemist, and we're going to be talking about how Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, along with his Christianity, are syncretically fused together, and then they're going to inform his magical practice and how he begins to reinterpret the magician based on some of the works from Marsilio Ficino and stuff like that. But Paracelsus was a Swiss physician or alchemist, depending on what you consider more important as a descriptor. He was a lay theologian. He's considered the father of toxicology, and there's a handful of other things that we're going to be referencing that he's considered to be the founder of or the father of. And I should mention that one of our resources today is going to be the Western Esoteric Traditions by Goodrick Clark. It's actually a really good book. It's a very common book used for if you were to take a sort of undergraduate course on an introduction to Western esoteric traditions or the Western esoteric traditions. This is a very common book that people will use to teach that course. And he has a section on alchemy and Paracelsus. And so we're going to be mentioning just a few paragraphs here and there in this book to give more context, to give more information, to provide some support. But we're going to be getting into Paracelsus, how he's a pioneer of chemical medicine, his holistic approach to medicine, which that holistic approach is going to be tied to a sort of Neoplatonic presupposition on the one, which is going to is also going to inform then his understanding of nature, his anthropology, his Hermetic anthropology of man, and that being tied to then even Christology and Christ and his Christianity. So that's what we're going to try to highlight. Keep this at a sort of, it's going to be a little bit abstract in the sense that we're going to be trying to show how a series of different ideas coalesce into the figure of Paracelsus. And this is why I think he's a very important and pivotal historical figure that people need to be aware of. And so That's where his natural theology, natural philosophy is going to come in, and he's going to actually be at tensions with the sort of rationalist tradition. And so this is all coming from. So now let's provide a little historical context for our conversation today. First, I was just mentioning Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pica della Mirandola. So previous video that I've done about a year ago, but we're going to try to encapsulate that really quickly here. Historical context is 15th century. As the more orthodox mind are going to be familiar with the Council of Florence. This is about mid 15th century. I think that's in the 1430s. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but during the Council of Florence, we get this infusion of Platonic and Greek thought into the Latin West. And so in Florence, at his academy, Marsilio Ficino had already come across, or because of the post-council, because of the infusion of Plato, he actually had Plato in the original, and he was translating that into the Latin until he got the Hermetic corpus. And so it's in, I believe, the 1450s where Marsilio Ficino stops what he's doing for the Medici family, Cosimo de' Medici. The Medicis were arguably the wealthiest family in the world, probably outside the Chinese emperor. And they wanted, or specifically Cosimo, really wanted to read the Hermetic corpus because it was believed that Hermes was older than Moses. It was believed that Hermes was the oldest philosopher in human history, and that he then is the sort of source of all this wisdom. And this spawned arguably what's called classicism to a degree, so this idea that older is better. And therefore, because Hermes was then perceived to be older than Plato, older than Moses, well, then we have to translate and read what Hermes has to say. And so Hermes Trismegistus, the Hermetic corpus, then is translated. And this is the infusion, or really, when you look at the Western esoteric traditions, this is often where it's sort of you have the theurgic practices, the magical practices of ancient paganism. You have alchemy already existing. This was an Egyptian tradition, if you will. And this is actually going to come into then the Islamic influences onto Paracelsus. But for Marsilio Ficino, he translates the Hermetic corpus, and he becomes enamored with a sort of magical interpretation, sympathetic correspondential understandings of nature, of reality, of the diffusion of cosmic energies, of astral energies, and stuff like this. So he was interested in the reading and singing the Orphic hymns, doing ritual magic with certain colors on certain days at certain times with certain incense and all this stuff being orchestrated together. He was interested in music's relationship to the sort of correspondential harmony of the universe, stuff like that. Now, his student, Giovanni Pica della Mirandola, he's going to be more interested in Kabbalah, and he's going to be interested in the use of Hebrew. And this is tied to, again, giving more historical context over in Spain at this point. So right now we're talking about the 15th century, the 1400s. Now it's this century where the Muslim occupation of Spain eventually ends. But before that happens, Spain is a place of immense syncretism. And the syncretism is between Neoplatonism, sort of the ancient philosophies, Judaism, and Christianity and Islam. And this is also where books like the Zohar are written. So Spain was a place where a lot of these different cultural and theological, philosophical ideas are being mixed. And that is also going to give context to today, because it's the Muslims actually that introduce alchemy into Europe. I don't think most people are totally conscious of that, but Islam took a real fascination of alchemy after their 7th century occupation or takeover of Egypt. And so once they did that, I believe that was in 1640, that this is when this sort of mystical syncretism occurs, and this generalistic one, this Neoplatonic idea of God is the basis for all these different religious figures getting around and trying to show how this all coalesces. And we have that happening in Spain. We have Giovanni Piccadella then being interested in those ideas and being enamored with the Old Testament, with Hebrew, with Kabbalah, and then arguing for a Christian Kabbalah. Now, again, he is the student, so we're talking 15th century, the student of Marsilio Ficino. Unfortunately, Giovanni Piccadella Mirandola it's contentious on how he died. Although, according to the course that I took in Berkeley, our professor and a handful of the graduate students all believe that it's because he was actually a homosexual and he was found sleeping with another man and he was murdered. So take that as you will. Maybe that is a sort of archetypal pattern you're perceiving in regards to magic and all this stuff. I have no idea. But alchemy in Islam, 640, Arab conquest of Egypt. They become very enamored with alchemy. They then reintroduce alchemy into Europe. This is basically 12th century. So we're talking about the 1100s here, around the same historical period as scholasticism is getting going. Anyways, that sets the context for Paracelsus because, again, he was born in 1493, so he's late 15th century, and it's 1517 where we have the Protestant Reformation. So 1517, he's living right through that. So it's a very interesting historical period. Now, often the way scholars frame the Western esoteric traditions, what I'll be talking about today in regards to alchemy and Hermeticism and natural theology, that this all arose because of Protestantism's sort of suppression of the mystical. And so we see this in Calvinism and things like that, where mysticism itself is traditionally going, at least in the minds of many of these Protestants, many of these Northern Europeans. Again, we're in Germany in today's video with Paracelsus. So they see mysticism as being tied to the Catholic Church. And they then want to sort of take these things out of the Christian doctrine, Christian theology, and have a sort of, a more basic, if you will. I don't know, a less. I don't want to say sophisticated because they were tightly trapped in their sort of rationalism and the sort of presuppositions of scholasticism itself. But anyways, by suppressing the mystical elements of religion, they began to flourish in things like alchemy and things like Hermeticism and Neoplatonism and all these sort of magical interpretations, because the other forms of, Protestantism, generally speaking, was trying to divorce a lot of the aesthetics, a lot of the mysticism out of Christianity. And so that's not a debatable, not totally, I mean, you can debate it, but that's not a controversial idea that I'm proposing there, that the Western esoteric traditions, really the whole continuous tradition of magic that's going to lead into theosophy, it's going to lead into Freemasonry, the Rosicrucians, the Hermetic Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley's Thelema, all this stuff is really a continuous strand of ideas emerging with Ficino in the translation of the Hermetic Corpus and through our figure of Paracelsus. And so that gives us some historical context for understanding Paracelsus and who he was. Now, for the medical theory, to understand how Paracelsus is going to sort of revolutionize things, I'm sure there's going to be things that occur in today's video and his ideas, his thoughts that you're going to be very antagonistic towards. That's totally fine. I'm not here to argue over the validity. I'm here just to give a sort of historical video on who this figure was and why they're important. But at the time, the sort of basic medical theories was, the four elements. So you have to watch for earth, water, air, fire, the four elements. And then you have the four humors. This comes from Galen, the famous Roman physician that believed blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. These are things then you have to watch out for that you can make diagnoses of based on what you're seeing from various individuals. and you could substitute hot, cold, wet, and dry, and you could transmute those into other things. This is the general medical theory at the time. And so this is what Paracelsus is going to start building upon, sort of the work of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna. These were all authorities in the sort of medical fields, okay? And so with that being said, now let's start to get into Paracelsus. Now, Paracelsus, again, he's taking in a lot of these Hermetic, Neoplatonic, magical ideas. He's inserting that into a Christianity that's now being divorced from the Catholic Church. He's right in the midst of the Protestant Reformation. He's considered the Luther of physicians. So he's a very controversial figure in the 16th century, and obviously specifically with medicine and alchemy. And the first thing that I wanted to read in regards to Paracelsus was this paragraph right here. Nature and humankind were his sources. He believed that a pious Christian faith, the evidence of his own senses, and a system of correspondences between the macro and the microcosm surpassed the book knowledge regurgitated from the ancient authorities such as Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. His radical approach to healing and medicine, his popular style, and his contempt for professional exclusivity and incompetence provoked the hostility of established authorities everywhere and led to his being called the Luther of physicians. In his work, we see how alchemy, when combined with Hermetic and Neoplatonic ideas, becomes a key to explain the unity and interconnectedness of man in health. And so that's what I wanted to frame in regards to, well, we're going to be looking at a Neoplatonic understanding of the one. And so we're going to be looking at a sort of dialectical tension between the macro and the micro. This is going to then inform his alchemy, because for his interpretation, the macrocosm is earth, nature, and the heavens. That's the macrocosm. And then you can begin to understand the macro through the micro. And the most obvious instrument to understanding the micro is man himself. He is an entire synthesis, an entire syncretic apparatus to understand the whole of the macrocosm. And so this is informing his idea. Therefore, he is moving away from the rationalism and moving more towards a sort of phenomenological, he wouldn't call it subjective. So I wouldn't say he's relativistic or anything, because he's putting a lot of his emphasis on his direct experiences, on his senses, and he is interested in then sort of realizing the hidden mysteries of nature that are going to allow man to then harmonize with the macro, harmonize the micro with the macro. And so then the alchemy itself, from the perspective of Paracelsus, is doing just this. And so he's, in regards to actual contributions to medicine, he's considered the founder of iatrochemistry, homeopathy, antisepsis, modern wound surgery. This is another thing that I wanted to highlight, is where he got so much experience with surgery and wound surgery was actually from his travels as an army surgeon. And so I want to read something real quick, again, on Paracelsus. And it reads, as the young doctor then embarked on a series of extensive travels around Europe between 1517 and 1524. 1517 is the Protestant Reformation, keep that in mind. These wanderings led him from Italy across France to Spain and Portugal, through France again, England, Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, Russia, Hungary, Croatia, across to Italy, and thence to Rhodes, Constantinople, and possibly Egypt. During this period, he enlisted as an army surgeon and was involved in the wars waged by Venice, Holland, Denmark, and the Tatars. His practical experience of surgery, Paracelsus added the great wealth of local and traditional medical folklore among the herbalists, bath attendants, peasants, gypsies, and magicians encountered in the course of his travels. So this is where he began to get a lot of his experience. Of course, he's going to go back to Germany after all this stuff and really begin to write books and try to hammer out his ideas. But you can already see, based on where he went through Spain, through Portugal, through France. He's being introduced to a lot of different things, and you can see he's already of the sort of Hermetic, Neoplatonic presupposition that all this stuff is one, and that somehow he can harmonize all this stuff together. And so his theology is really a mix of natural theology, obviously, right? That somehow by observing nature, by trusting your senses, you can get to the basis of truth, of some type of real knowledge. And then it's a humanism that's going to be totally tied to the theology of Hermeticism, man being the measure of all things, man being the brother of God. Man then is the summation of creation. As Christians, as Orthodox, we don't disagree that man is the priest of creation. But this is going to lead to a sort of humanism that's also being developed during the Renaissance period. So I would say, in my opinion, this isn't something that Goodrick Clark says, but theologically speaking, we're seeing a mix between humanism and natural theology. And in his first famous book, that is called the Paragonum, that is 1529 to 1530s when this was written. He begins to explicate his medical theories, his alchemical theories. And one of them is that medicine should be founded on natural philosophy, astronomy, alchemy, and virtue. And so virtue, in the more traditional way in which we use that verb, we're talking about maybe the virtuous life, the way you live virtuously, a more righteous living. That is sort of what he means by that, because as we'll get to later, he actually viewed sickness and plague and the things like that really due to a sort of sin, that the disharmony of creation is due to man's sinful nature. Clearly, that's going to be tied to his Christian theology, but virtue for him is more, he used it in a very different way, that it means the inherent power of people and things. So certain herbs can have virtues, or he can extract those virtues from it. And this is where he gets ideas related to pills and the extraction of herbs and stuff like this, is trying to extract the virtue out of something and then use that virtue to heal or some type of utility for something else. So, and also another important idea that he had was the theory of three principles. And this was sulfur, mercury, and salt, and how they were combined with. So he likes to take a sort of tripartite approach to things. We see this a lot in Christian theology, right? Representative of the Trinity. And so sulfur for him is the soul, mercury is the spirit, and salt is the body. And obviously sulfur, mercury, and salt are going to be essential in terms of a sort of alchemical process, and a chemical understanding of the sort of distillation of different things. And so even the distillation process in alchemy, you can see tied to his understanding of virtues within things and extracting those from them. You can see these ideas already coalescing. And so a quick little thing that I also wanted to highlight was after he did all these travels as an army surgeon, and he decided to begin to settle down, he was basically given the position of the town physician. And there's just a quick sentence here that I wanted to read. The post of town physician gave him the right to lecture at the university, but Paracelsus provoked the university authorities by lecturing on practical and theoretical medicine as it had emerged in his own work and experience, rather than the theories of Hippocrates and Galen. Moreover, he lectured not in Latin for the academic elite, but in German to large and enthusiastic audiences, which included both students and artisan barber surgeons. In these lectures, Paracelsus was forming the nucleus of his medical system during a highly fruitful phase of his life. And so I couldn't help but when I read that think of another connection, another sympathy with Luther himself, is that he wasn't giving his lectures in Latin like the priest or doing mass, but he was actually speaking in the vernacular of the many in German, and therefore anybody could listen to him and his lectures and his orations on medicine and alchemy, and really he's going to be tied to Hermeticism and all this stuff. So moving on, I wanted to say that his understanding of the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt is actually a little bit different than how the elements were understood during medieval alchemy. And so they were more understood as sort of elementals and stuff like this. So I just wanted to highlight there is a subtle difference there. But the first thing that I wanted to read in regards to Paracelsian alchemy was this. Paracelsus was inspired by the Renaissance Neoplatonic conception that the whole of creation, the heavens, the earth, and all nature, represented a macrocosm, and that its unity was reflected in a variety of possible microcosms, right? And that's what I was saying, that man would be the most obvious, but the alchemical process is looking at microcosms to understand the macrocosm, of which man is the most perfect. The analogies and correspondences between the macrocosm and the microcosm were central to his cosmology, theology, natural philosophy, and medicine. Paracelsus expressed a deep distrust of logic and rational thought as a scientific tool, since man was the climax of creation. Uniting with himself all the constituents of the world, he could have direct knowledge of nature on account of a sympathy between the inner representative of a particular object in his own constitution and its external counterpart. For Paracelsus, this union with the object is the principal means of acquiring intimate and total knowledge. And so we see right there a sort of tension between the more traditional rationalistic understandings of knowledge of epistemology versus a more phenomenological, experiential based. And he was much more interested in the experiential basis. So he actually, his theory, he rejected, most people when you hear alchemy, they say, oh, that's that whole thing where they wanted to turn lead into gold. Well, yeah, for some people that's true, but when you start getting into the Western esoteric traditions, people like Paracelsus, even somebody like a John Dee, it's way more than just that. Even though John Dee and Edward Kelly are going to be wrapped up with the whole transmutation of lead into gold for Rudolph, Paracelsus actually rejected as that being the purpose of alchemy at all. And he understood alchemy rather as the perfection of nature and man's imperfections. So think about this again in regards to a larger schema of ideas, that as a Christian, he saw the world as fallen and that there were imperfections in nature, and that therefore it was on the alchemist, it was on the magician, it was on the physician, which we're going to get to where that's totally tied to Ficino. Marsilio Ficino was a physician and a magician, and so Ficino tied these two roles together, given their sort of classicism, the idea that the older something is, the better it is, the truer it is, that, well, that's the way the Chaldeans did it. That's the way the Egyptians did it. That's the way the Persians did it. The physician and the magician were the same person. So therefore, that's what we have to do now in the Renaissance period, because we're getting back to what is right, what is good, what is true. So Paracelsus, working off that framework, then sees nature as fallen and sees his role as a physician, as an alchemist, as a magician, in terms of perfecting the fallen world to become more in accordance with heaven itself, the macrocosm. You see, so for him, it wasn't explicitly, because he's wrapped up, he still perceives himself to be a pious Christian. And so you can see how these ideas are working together. And so for him, the as above, so below, as within, so without, the sort of famous Hermetic adage totally holds true even within his Christian framework and Christian worldview. And so moving on, there's another paragraph here that I wanted to highlight in regards that Paracelsus generally spiritualized matter and claiming that such spiritual forces are the true elements and principles, while the elements and chemical substances are themselves crystallized deposits of such forces. Taking the notion of prime matter or arche or ousia from ancient Stoicism, Paracelsus regarded the visible elements as the results of interaction between the qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, and this prime matter was a kind of vital matter spirit. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because of the way in which he understood the astral influences of astrology and all these things influencing people's health. So he was firmly rooted in a sort of astrological interpretation of the world, because he's totally enamored with this idea of correspondences and sympathetic relationships between things. Of course, he believes in the sort of efficacy of the energies of the powers being emanated from the stars themselves. Of course, he is an emanationist because he is totally wrapped up in a Neoplatonic worldview. So the world itself is an emanation that all goes back to the one God. And so, again, he's greatly influenced by Renaissance Neoplatonism. We've already kind of beat that horse. And we've talked about the macrocosm and the reflection of man as the microcosm. Now, there's an interesting Neoplatonic dualism, I would say, between the visible and the invisible that is certainly replete within Paracelsus' worldview, in that there's always this dynamic, this tension between matter and spirit, between the visible and the non-visible. We see this in Gnosticism, we see this in Platonism, we see this in Neoplatonism. There's always this sort of internal tension, and the one that is superior is always the non-physical. And that somehow matter is sort of degraded, it's lesser, it's more mundane than spirit. Which, of course, from an Orthodox perspective, with the incarnation of the Logos, we wouldn't have that same dialectical tension between creation and the creator, or the non-physical, or the spirit, or something like that. So when we see these ideas, we can kind of root them in their historical worldview of whether it be Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, whatever. And so nature, as I said, is an emanation of God. And the purpose of alchemy is to restore harmony. Sickness is due to astral influences. Therefore, to cure, one must know astrology and alchemy. And what I wanted to say in regards to some of his contributions to the medical field is I wanted to read this quick little paragraph, and it reads, "His specific contributions to medicine are impressive and include a humanitarian and ethical approach toward the patient, especially the mentally ill, a recognition of the healing power of nature and the value of antiseptic principles, progressive views on syphilis, and a rejection of guaiac and mercury as treatments, knowledge of the diuretic action of mercury and its curative powers in dropsy, the connection between minerals and drinking water in certain places, studies of spa waters, and observations of the beneficial digestive effects of certain acidic waters, the description of miner's disease as an occupational illness in which he shows the greater toxic risk in metals than in salts, and recounts a concrete etiology with numerous symptoms." And so he is a very interesting and worthwhile individual, like I was trying to highlight, who actually contributes to things present in the medical field, medical practices. But now I want to move more to his philosophy, his theology, and highlighting more of the worldview in which he's working from, and how, again, Paracelsus is putting all these things together, which is what makes him such a historical and pivotal figure, because people then look back to Paracelsus, they read Paracelsus, especially within the German context, which is going to inform later much of Northern Europe, when after the Protestant Reformation really gets going, where you basically have the Protestant North versus the Catholic South, and you're going to see the proliferation of the Western esoteric traditions be a little bit different, more numerous, I would say, in Northern Europe because of that dialect, because that smashing out of the mysticism that I was trying to say. Well, mysticism can be found in all these esoteric and these magical practices. And so Paracelsus' philosophy of nature and alchemy initiates a specifically German variant of Renaissance Neoplatonism. His work certainly reflects Marsilio Ficino's ideas, inasmuch as his medical vocation absorbed the theory of two worlds and correspondences, the physician as Magus, intervening as a transmutated soul in the spiritual hierarchy of nature. And this is a very interesting quote going from Paracelsus talking about his sort of indebtedness to Marsilio. And, this is, just hear this quote out. This is from Paracelsus. Surely Marsilius is a priest, talking about Marsilio Ficino. People will say, what has a priest to do with medicine? What again with astrology? Why should he, a Christian, interest himself in magic and images, in the life emanating the whole of the world? Ficino's answer is that the most ancient priests, Chaldean, Persian, Egyptian, were physicians as well as astronomers, and thereby served piety and charity. And so that was the classicism that I was trying to highlight earlier, that because that's the way they did it back in the day, that must be the way in which we need to do it again, because that must be the true way, and sort of the specialization of knowledge is a problem that we need to, again, get the Neoplatonic idea to get everything into a one. Well, then the physician must be that one, that magician, the astrologer, the alchemist, the scholar. It all has to be one individual. Again, based on this sort of Neoplatonic oneness. Magic is not a profane cultivation of demons, but captures the heavenly gifts hidden in natural objects for the promotion of health. This is how he understood it. Now, of course, we can disagree with this, that magic, in its essence, I wouldn't define it as a sort of cultivation of demons, but a deviation of one's will with God's will, and then using magical correspondential processes, methodologies that we do believe as Christians that actually can affect the world, to establish one's will as real, as dominant, as manifested in reality, something of that nature. So, but I just wanted to highlight that because that's how he was working from a sort of Ficino understanding that, well, magic isn't about the cultivation of demons. No, magic, because I'm a physician, no, it's more about revealing the hidden gifts within nature to promote health. Oh, okay, interesting. So you can see that redefinition there. Another thing that I wanted to read was developing his own distinctive brand of Hermetic medicine. Paracelsus saw plague as a thunderbolt from heaven, affecting a certain metabolism in nature at large and the corresponding process in man. But first, it is man who creates the astral semina of the disease, giving rise to an infectious contagion. This is a physical entity, a body, but it is created by something non-corporeal, the sinful passion and imagination of man. The Neoplatonic principle of the force of imagination is thus involved, leading to the notion of a psychic element in bodies and vice versa, and thus to an abolition of strict dualism. So, I see that being much more Christian in basis than sort of Neoplatonic principle, the force of the imagination, although I get what Goodrick Clark is saying there. The non-corporeal spirit begets corporeal matter, a train of thought that is recognizable in Campanella's Sensum Rerum, and later in the philosophy of Van Helsman and Leibniz. Now, Campanella, there's a good book by Walker called Spiritual and Demonic Magic, From Ficino to Campanella. I'll have to do a video on that. That's actually a pretty interesting topic in and of itself. But I was quite interested in Hermeticism and sort of this whole magical tradition within Europe. So that's why I like making these videos and talking about them, even though I might not support these ideas. So we've established the priest, physician, magician. This is all one entity in the mind of Paracelsus, and he got this from Ficino, who was working on this classicist understanding, enamored with Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. And so Paracelsus represents a sort of German variant of Renaissance Neoplatonism. And, well, actually, I'm going to read a few more things because Goodrick Clark words it very well. So this is talking about, we're going to be talking about Astronomia Magna, or the whole sageist philosophy of the macrocosm and the microcosm. This book is Paracelsus' most famous work. This is really his magnum opus, about 5 years before he dies, in which he's basically enumerating all his ideas and theories on magic, on alchemy, on medicine, and putting these all together. And so that is 1537 to 1538. Again, he dies in 1541. So in it, he's talking about man as microcosm composed of the macrocosm. Therefore, he is composed of the world itself. We hear this in something like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? This, you are the universe. Even an Alan Watts, you are the universe looking back at itself. Well, Paracelsus was certainly of this sort of worldview. All things are interconnected. He absolutely believed it because all things have to lead back to the one. The Magus unites the celestial and terrestrial for good. So he basically is devoid, the way he describes alchemy and magic, it's totally devoid of any sort of nefarious attempts to do the opposite. He like Ficino, totally redefines it as this positive, as this really moral practice for the good of everybody, for the good of the world, right? I mean, because they believe that they're perfecting the imperfections of nature, of the fallen world. And the degeneration and regeneration till all returns to God. This is also essential in his worldview, and this is essential to Neoplatonism. And even in our previous video on pre-Socratic philosophy, this was something that they iterated over and over and over again, is that somehow the one and the many problem was being re-understood as the one somehow breaking up into the many. And Empedocles associated this with the forces of love and hate, and that love is the process of things coming back to the one, and hate is the sort of the separation, the degeneration of the world itself, and that where we find ourselves is somewhere right in the middle between absolute love and absolute hate. That's there in the pre-Socratic philosophy. Now, fast forward, we're looking at basically almost 2,000 years, and we're seeing a similar understanding in the Neoplatonic understanding of Paracelsus, in that the world is this continual degeneration, then regeneration, regeneration, and then the regeneration always going back to what he calls the Lord, the One. So now I just want to read a handful of things from this book to wrap up and maybe discuss them in between. But this is based on his famous work here, the whole sageist philosophy of the macrocosm and the microcosm. That's where I'm referring to here. Man is made out of the macrocosm and his nature therein. The key Paracelsian term, the light of nature, denotes his nature philosophy, which reveals the interconnectedness of all living things. The Magus can gain the marvelous knowledge of the celestial and terrestrial worlds, enabling him to work for good in nature as a natural philosopher or physician. Likewise, the Unitarian Neoplatonic position is seemingly upheld by Paracelsus' doctrine of the soul. Quote, man has two bodies, one from the earth, the second from the stars, and thus they are easily distinguishable. The elemental material body goes to the grave with its essence. The sidereal subtle body dissolves gradually and goes back to its source, but the Spirit of God in us, which is like his image, returns to him whose image it is. And so throughout the Astronomia Magna, one sees that Paracelsus is using a threefold hierarchical view of the world: mundane, celestial, and eternal, corresponding to the body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is divine and will, as in the emanationist Neoplatonic philosophy of Plotinus, which was Ficino's great inspiration, return to the Godhead. This was the threefold hierarchical world of Neoplatonic cosmology, and came through Ficino and Pico to Trithemius and Agrippa, still present in John Dee's rigid Theology and Robert Flood's wonderful engravings. So Johannes Trithemius, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, that's who they're referring to there. Of course, John Dee and Edward Kelly. I'll do videos on all these individuals later because I find all this stuff interesting. And so if you don't know who I'm talking about, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. But there is a different emphasis in Paracelsus, for even here he also uses a dualistic scheme to distinguish the eternal and temporal. Man, nature, and the stars comprise the microcosmic worlds that are living, interconnected, and full of marvelous correspondences. Nature, accordingly, displays the divine seals and signatures, parentheses, emanations of God. So whenever you see that, you know we're talking about Neoplatonism, which is the physician's business to read, understand, and act upon. These, the Magus or priest-physician, can apprehend and apply, for he embodies the cryptic knowledge in himself as a result of the meaningful hermetic structure of all creation. There is also an eternal wisdom which springs directly from the light of the Holy Spirit. And again, man is able to distinguish eternal wisdom from the temporal wisdom because he is the image of God. And so this emphasis on the image of God, I would say, makes sense in two ways. The Hermetic presuppositions of a sort of divinized, elevated status, an elevated anthropology of man in relation to the Creator, and then the one, you can see how then being made in the image of God, I think this idea could be emphasized even more given those presuppositions. And here is a great quote, very long quote of Paracelsus, talking about, really, I think here we can really get a feel for his German Reformation theology being fused with all these different things. And so here he's talking about the macrocosm, the microcosm, and the deference to the Lord, obviously God. The beasts take their nature from the stars, but man draws his mortal wisdom, reason, and art from the stars. And everything that comes from the light of nature must be learned from the light of nature, excepting only the image of God, which is subject to the Spirit which the Lord has given to man, the Holy Spirit. The Spirit instructs man in supernatural and eternal things, and after the separation of matter from spirit, it returns to the Lord. So that's a little something there. So in regards to the legacy of Paracelsus, the Paracelsian idea offers another illustration of the way in which he combines Hermetic ideas of degeneration and regeneration with the Christian idea of redemption. His belief that the whole macrocosm was the product of some separative process, we talked about already present in the pre-Socratics, was fundamental to his philosophy. All individuation and specialization was seen as breaking away from the original divine unity and simplicity. And we see that in the physician, magician, astrologer, all these different things being combined into a single individual as opposed to the sort of differentiation and specialization. But the Christian is redeemed. Redemption is wrought by Christ's atonement. As a successor and as a receiver of his sacramental body, the Christian will return to God. It is noteworthy that Paracelsus' Christology was not as radical as that as Caspar Schönweckfeld and others in doubting the true humanity of Christ, but pointed to the early modern Protestant spiritualistic Christology of somebody like Jakob Böhme. And he's another individual that I'm definitely going to be doing a video on, is Jakob Burma. Most of you guys may have heard of him. He's a little bit, well, it's hard to tell who's more famous than most people, but he did not, talking about Paracelsus, he did not want to found a new sect, but strove instead for a church of the spirit, subject only to God and nature. Paracelsus' religion of the two lights, namely the light of grace and the light of nature, was taken up by Adam Hausmeyer, the first commentator on the Rosicrucian manifestos, which invoked the example of Paracelsus. At the beginning of the 17th century, Paracelsus gave an important impetus to the Rosicrucian movement and strongly influenced Michael Meyer and the famous Christian mystic Jakob Burma. By the second half of the century, so the second half of the 16th century, the late 1500s, his importance had been eclipsed by the primacy of the rational empiricism in science and medicine. So what he was in opposition to, that radical empiricism, that radical rationalism, he was in opposition to. Paracelsus' ideas were rediscovered by Goethe, Novalis, Schelling, and other German Romantic thinkers who found in him an exponent for their own natural philosophy, current from the close of the 18th century. His name and works were popularized as a leading figure in the revival of Neoplatonism, regarded as an ancient wisdom tradition by the Theosophists H.P. Blavatsky, Franz Hartmann, and Rudolf Steiner in the modern occult revival at the end of the 19th century. And so that would be called the traditionalist school. And so if you may have heard my conversation with Jay Dyer, I was much more interested in sort of the Western esoteric, the Hermetic, the Neoplatonic stuff. He was much more interested in the traditionalist school, people like Steiner and the Blavatskys and stuff like that. So just wanted to highlight what that was. Jung also was a great advocate of Paracelsus because he saw Paracelsus taking a sort of very semiotic, a symbolic understanding of his alchemical processes as one actually discovering literal things in nature through the distillation of herbs and minerals and stuff like that, but also as a sort of immense fractal hermetic understanding. Jung loved that idea. Of course, Jung was a Gnostic, so he loved the sort of immense dualism between matter and spirit, or non-physical, physical, or however you wanted to frame it, evil, good. But Jung really liked Paracelsus and celebrated Paracelsus. And so here's like a little section here. It says, Jung celebrated Paracelsus for his source of knowledge in the twin lights of nature and revelation, and believed Paracelsus' work to be an early intimation of the role of the unconscious, arguing that alchemy is the forerunner of our modern psychology of the unconscious. He claimed Paracelsus as a pioneer of, quote, empirical psychology and psychotherapy, unquote. Now, do I think Paracelsus was into those things? No, not necessarily, although you can see that given the way that they understood alchemy as doing much more than just an actual chemical transmutation, coagulation, distillation, or whatever they're trying to do, right? But I'm not the biggest Jung fan because I think everything then becomes psychological, which is another problem. But certainly Jung can be interesting. There's useful things in there as well, but I just wanted to highlight that. And so in regards to Paracelsus, he stands as a liminal figure between Renaissance philosophy and its empirical application in nature and medicine, witness to the practical application of the key esoteric ideas of correspondences, living nature, intermediaries, and imagination, and his concept of transmutation bridged both medical alchemy and the human beings needed of grace by God. So that concludes our video today. A little bit longer than expecting, but hope you guys enjoy it. That is Paracelsus, the famous Paracelsus, who I'm sure some of you guys hadn't heard of, but now you probably know more than you ever wanted to know. And so let me know what you guys think. Please like, share, and subscribe this video. If you know anybody who might be interested in these video topics, please share the video with them. Sharing the video is the best way to get more people eyeballs on it, more people to get in the conversation here. And if you haven't, please also click that bell so you can get notifications for when I go live, for when I'm premiering a video, for when I post a video. So that always helps. So please hit the notification button. Please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thank you guys for all the love and support. I have no idea what topic I'm going to do in my next video. So if you got something interesting, throw it in the comment section. I might go ahead and do it. If not, I may think of something myself. I usually do. But anyways, thank you guys for all the love and support. And until next time, as always, God bless.
Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.